A federal inmate from Arkansas with influential Arkansas friends gets a midsummer present from the president. The central bank the president loves to chastise makes money a little cheaper, but enough to trickle down to Arkansas business. In our seat of government, more friction between a new mayor and his staff and the city board and the police. But first, talking trade, tariffs, taxes, and timber with the congressman from our 4th District. Arkansas Week coming up.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. In this week's broadcast, among other stories, a former big businessman in Arkansas gets a big break from the White House, and continuing uncertainty for the government of the state's largest city. We'll go to our roundtable in a moment, but first tonight, the summer recess for Arkansas school children is nearing its end, though it's only begun for most members of Congress. Joining us now, U.S. Representative Bruce Westerman of Arkansas's 4th District. Congressman, thanks very much for coming in.
Steve, so good to be with you. Good to be back in the natural state, out of D.C. for a while.
Well, things were a bit unnatural in the district in which you spent a lot of time recently, in recent years, I mean. Just a couple of hours before we tape this interview, on the other side of the Capitol, the Senate put the finishing touches, final legislative approval on the budget bill, which you voted against in the House.
Right.
Why?
Mainly it's a process issue. We continue to run large deficits. Our debt's approaching $22 trillion if you add the intergovernmental debt to it. And something as big as the spending bill for the year should be addressed by the whole Congress, not just what's known as the four corners with the Speaker, the Minority Leader, the Senate Majority and Minority Leaders, and a representative from the White House. These are big decisions that impact our future, and for them to come up with a bill that has no restraints on spending, it's just business as usual, and say, here, pass this, you've got to do it. That's not what the people of the 4th District of Arkansas elected me to go and do. And
well, the White House seems perfectly happy with it, or happy enough.
Yeah. Well, there's the part of it that if you run up a debt, you've got to address that debt. And I get the reason why you have to raise the debt ceiling, because you have to pay your bills. If the federal government's not paying their bills, we've got big problems. But we should use these as opportunities to go back and address the issues that are causing the bills to increase. And none of that was done during this budget negotiation. And again, it was a negotiation between leadership in the House and the Senate and a cabinet member.
Well, if the budget agreement isn't to your satisfaction, the tax bill of a couple of years ago you supported that, and CBO and among others say that is a principal driver of the deficits, which are now higher than ever.
Yeah, and you have to look at the way CBO does their accounting. If you look at the amount
CBO isn't alone. You'd grant that, though, Mr. Westerman. It's not alone in its analysis.
Our tax revenue last year was higher than the revenue before. So we're still bringing in more revenue to the federal government than we were bringing in before the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The problem is CBO builds in increases in the budget over the 10-year window, and the tax revenue that CBO had projected was not as high as, or the actual tax revenue was not as high as what the CBO projected. And even though it was more tax revenue, they say it's a detriment to the budget. And that's the same way they'll build in automatic spending increases. And if you reduce spending from those automatic projections by CBO, they're saying you're cutting spending. So you could have a 3% increase in spending and have cut the growth from 6% to 3%, and CBO would say you're making draconian cuts, when in effect you're spending more money in the current fiscal year in an area than you spent in the previous year. So that's one of the issues I've had with CBO and the way Congress does budgets since I've been in Congress, and I served my first 2 terms on the Budget Committee, so I got immersion by fire on the way that budgeting process works.
So in other words, the tax bill is, are you saying it's revenue neutral or close?
It's actually, we're still taking in more revenue than we took in the year before.
Or deficit neutral, I should say. Rather than...
Well, if CBO says if you hadn't have done the tax bill, you'd have taken in even more revenue. But over time, I think the revenue generated by the tax cuts will exceed where CBO had originally projected revenue would be without the tax cuts, because you've got a growing economy. You've got low unemployment. You've got more jobs than you have people available to fill those jobs. Not only is unemployment decreasing, but you've also got the labor participation rate that's increasing. So you've got more people going into the workforce and more and less people unemployed. So those are all very positive indicators. And we have seen some increase in wages to go along with that because of competition in the job market.
The president just a couple of hours ago announced that he is going to raise the stakes on the Chinese. Mm-hmm. Another round of tariff, I think about $300 billion in additional tariffs this time. With your reaction to that?
So I've never been one that's a huge fan of tariffs. I understand why the administration, why this president's doing what he's doing, is because he's trying to get us back to a level playing field with the Chinese. A tariff is a tax on the consumer because the consumer ends up paying that fee. But what we've seen is the Chinese are playing by a different set of rules than what we play by. Oftentimes you see U.S. Businesses competing one-on-one against the Chinese government, which is backing business there. I've testified before the Trade Commission on several cases where China has dumped into the U.S. market. Every time I've testified, the U.S. companies have won those hearings, but the damage is already done. And the Chinese have no qualms about copying our technology, thumbing their nose at our patent laws, and also subsidizing companies, which gives them a very unfair advantage with the U.S. workers. So I'm all for getting these trade disputes settled, doing the bilateral negotiations. USMCA, that one's been ready to pass for quite some time now, and it's just a matter of getting it on the floor, getting Speaker Pelosi to put it out for a vote, and I think it'll pass with flying colors. That would do great with Mexico and Canada, and to get that trade issue settled, and then start working on more of these with China, with Japan, with the UK. And as well as the economy is doing now, the more of these trade resolutions that we can get firmed up on, the better off we'll be.
Are you? Well, he's got trade wars going on multiple fronts.
Right.
Whether it be ag or manufacturing sector in your district, is this hurting your district?
It hurts in some cases, and it helps in other cases. But at the end of the day, what you want is fair trade, where the American worker's competing on the same playing field with the foreign worker. And actually, the tax bill that we passed put American companies on a more level playing field with foreign companies, because we had a higher corporate tax rate than all the foreign competitors we were competing against. So just getting that tax rate lower for individuals and for corporations gave us a better advantage to compete on the world market. There's always extenuating circumstances when you start tinkering with trade. You can look at the Cooper tire facility down in Texarkana. They have a steel belting that goes in the tire. The steel belting that goes in that tire is, it may be now, at one time was not manufactured in the United States. If they couldn't get that, then you put in danger that whole tire facility of being able to produce tires, and there's a lot of jobs that go into that. So the administration's worked with us to get exclusions where necessary, but again, this is a massive country, massive economy, and one little tweak on trade can have a domino effect in different places. So I'm ready to get the trade issues settled and get us focused on doing business and making our companies and farms and everything else as productive as possible.
Let's talk timber for just a second. It's one of your specialties, a key interest. As it happens, I just returned a few hours ago from the shadow of the San Bernardino National Forest in California. And while I was there, I asked as many people as I could about your proposal on forestry, and I got a mixed reaction, which I sense anyway, was the response in the last Congress. You had problems in the Senate.
Right. So the bill you're talking about is the Resilient Federal Forest Act.
Correct.
And just a little bit more of my background. I'm the only forester in the House, so when I went to Congress, I automatically kind of became the forestry expert. And there's a lot of people in the world that know more about forestry than I do. That's just none of them serve in the United States Congress. So I've been really pleased to get to work in that area, which obviously affects the 4th District in Arkansas, where we have so much timber. And all I'm asking and trying to promote in the Resilient Federal Forest Act is good science-based management practices on our federal lands. We've gotten some of those provisions included in the Farm Bill that are starting to be implemented. With the horrific fires we saw in California last year, even Governor Newsom in California has come around and said we have too restrictive of rules in place to do the management that we need to on the forest in California. And he voluntarily is working with CAL FIRE to do sound management practices, but not have to go through all the environmental hoops that the state of California has set in place to do those practices. It's often been said trees are the lungs of the earth, but they're also the kidneys of the earth. Through photosynthesis, they take in carbon dioxide, release oxygen, store that carbon, but they also work as great water purifiers. And often what you see in California and other places where you get these massive wildfires, there's no root structure left in the soil, and you get rains and you end up with landslides and mudslides and pollution in the streams. And we really know how to do it a better way. And we've done it a better way in our country in the past. We've just got to get back to implementing the sound science on our federal lands. Just
seconds later, a couple of the environmental people that I spoke with out there say the cost of your bill is still too high on the environment. Your response?
I would totally disagree with that. We manage forest in Arkansas. We've got 16 million more tons of trees in Arkansas today than we had this time last year. California is in a net drain. They've got fewer standing live trees in California today than they had this time last year. So look at the states who implement forest management practices and look at what's happening on the ground. And there's no question that implementing the science is a better way to do it.
Representative Bruce Westerman, thank you very much for being with us.
Good to
we'll
be
see you
with
again soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be right back with a roundtable. Back now with more stuff and a couple of pals, including Rebecca Hall, reporter for Arkansas Times, and Wesley Brown from Talk Business and Politics. Wes, let's start with you. Well, anybody, we had a presidential intervention of sorts, completely lawful, completely constitutional, in a high-profile Arkansas name this past week.
Yeah, Ted Sewell, if you remember back in, I think it's around 2006, he was convicted and always in Arkansas, it's related to Medicaid. It was bribery charges and Medicaid fraud. So originally he got 7 years, but the president saw fit on the recommendation of former Governor Mike Huckabee and our former U.S. Attorney Bud Cummins. He made that recommendation that his sentence be commuted. So what that means is that he no longer has to spend time in federal prison. So it was among, I think, the president made 2 commutations and 5 pardons. So, and some of them were pretty controversial, but this one got a lot of attention here in Arkansas, of course.
Yeah, what was controversial at the time was the relationship between the money that Mr. Sewell's companies were being paid in Medicaid funds, and his close personal relationship with Mr. Huckabee.
Yeah, and the fact that everybody knows that the governor's daughter was the president's spokesperson, and now she's rumored to be making a run for the governor of Arkansas. So that whole kind of connection is some people in the Democratic Party saying that should have the commutation process should be a little bit more vetted than this one was. So I think, and we're probably going to have some more of those kind of commutations coming from the White House in the future too. So
yeah, we'll hear about that one again, though. For some time.
Yeah,
Depending on how politics unfolds, but also we had at the local level, we had Rebecca West, a matter involving a sitting state representative.
Yeah, Representative Gates, who was in. Hasn't paid taxes for
15 years.
15 years,
Yeah.
And he serves in the state legislature making policy on tax issues. So he made a plea agreement at the circuit court level, and he now has to pay a $75,000 fine. But I guess the controversy is that he refused to resign after he made that plea agreement, and he will continue to serve in the Arkansas legislature. We've known about this for a while.
It's been in the news, yeah.
Yeah, for a couple of years now, so we've come to the end of this. Usually, in that sense, when you make that plea, the Democratic Party called for him to step down, but he has stated very affirmatively that he doesn't plan to step down. So, a lot of things going on in the Arkansas legislature when it comes to plea agreements in the past few months.
It tends to keep, Rebecca, the story alive in terms of disenchantment with the legislative process. You got to remember.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you're probably going to see going into the next, even the fiscal session coming up, or the next legislative session in 2022. That's going to come up, and people are going to say, maybe that we should do more about the ethics process with Arkansas General Assembly.
Speaking of fiscal matters, we had the Fed did what it was expected to do this week. Mr. Trump, I guess maybe he was expected to add more tariffs on, but he did, Wesley. Now we had a first quarter slowdown in GDP. With cheaper money, at least in the near term anyway, what does this do to how's this going to impact Arkansas? That and the tariff.
Oh, well, you've got the Fed interest rate going down a quarter point. Some people believe this will and this is the first cut since post-recession. So the fact that it was a surprise, it could speed up some people are talking about a recession in 2021, and I think this was kind of the Fed saying, okay, we want to soften that landing, so to speak. But and then you mentioned the fact that the president's talking about putting $300 billion of tariffs on China. It's still going to be tough, especially for the Arkansas economy, in terms of the key manufacturing sector, the agri sector, and those sectors that we do, where we export and we do a lot of business overseas. And so Arkansas, it's going to be interesting dynamic over the next few months, and the stocks are kind of in that stage where we don't know what they're going to do right now. So we'll have to wait and see. But I do think that we'll be able to see, some slowdown in the economy, especially with GDP. I think it was at only 2.4% or mid.
Dropped a full point, I believe.
Yeah, just a full point, 2.1%. So that tells us that that the things are slowing down a little bit, and I think we need to watch and see what's going to take place with the Fed and that whole dynamic with the president.
You have been watching Ms. Hall, City Hall.
Yes, I have, very closely.
And there is so much news involved there. I don't know where to begin, but so take it.
Okay, so we'll start with the closure of War Memorial and Heineman golf courses. So the closure of these courses was approved by the board of directors and the mayor, but the specific courses that were approved to close, those were decided by Scott himself. So again, like I said, those are War Memorial and Heineman. They closed at the beginning of July. Now, kind of what we're looking at for the future of those courses is Mayor Scott has appointed a task force to figure out what the two parks will look like, what kind of different recreational activities will be there once they're repurposed, as well as how the repurposing is going to be funded, because that's up in the air right now too.
Well, what's really up in the air, more than, at the moment anyway, more than parks, is police.
Right, yes, exactly. It has been a pretty intense past couple of weeks for relationships between the mayoral administration and the police here, starting with when Scott and Police Chief Keith Humphrey proposed an ordinance that would create a Citizens Review Board here for the Little Rock Police Department. So what this Citizens Review Board is supposed to do is sort of act as an auditor of the investigations that are conducted into complaints about officer misconduct at the department, officer-involved shootings, really any internal investigation that the department does. This Citizens Review Board will now be able to review as it is happening. And so the problem with this is that the Fraternal Order of Police and the Black Police Officers Association have been very critical of the ordinance. They've said that there's already an avenue of police review that exists, which is the Civil Service Commission, the City Civil Service Commission, which reviews employee appeal hearings, things like that. And they've also said that the ordinance gives too much power to Mayor Scott and not enough power to the rest of the board of directors.
Well, some power is with the prosecuting attorney in these cases as well, but there is a decidedly, you're talking about the Civil Service Commission, we have an appeal underway right now in a recent police officer involved shooting, resulted in a fatality.
Right.
And it seems like the temperature has gone up with allegations anyway, statements anyway, by some officers that they were immediately pressured to dismiss the officer.
Right. Right. So last week was the first part of the appeal hearing for former LRPD officer Charles Starks, who was fired from the police force in May after he shot and killed Bradley Blackshear during a felony stop this past February. So Starks is appealing his termination. He's seeking to be reinstated as an officer for the police department. And during his hearing, it was a day of 8-hour testimony. Really, lots of things went down on this day. But one of the most important takeaways is that Assistant Chiefs Hayward Finks and Alice Folk, both of whom were passed up as police chiefs during Mayor Scott's review of the candidates for that.
One African American, one white.
Right. Both were passed up for that in favor of Chief Humphrey, who's originally from Norman, Oklahoma. Anyway, they both testified that Mayor Scott pressured them from the beginning to investigate and fire Officer Starks quickly.
With all this going on, Rebecca, where does this put it's still new, in its 8th month now.
Right.
Beginning its 8th month, the Scott administration, young, dynamic African-American mayor of Arkansas's capital city.
Absolutely. I think that, now at this week's board meeting, Scott said himself that he has enacted change in these first 210 days or so. Change has come. And so now I think where Scott is positioned is really going to be seeing the consequences of these changes. What are going to be the resulting actions that come from these changes? What is the repurposing of these golf courses going to look like? Where is that funding going to come from? Who will he appoint to the Citizens Review Board? And surrounding the Citizens Review Board, is he going to address any of the complaints of the police unions?
Yeah, and it'll be interesting that, generally a new chief executive at mayor gets a honeymoon period. It'll be interesting to see how long that honeymoon period is over, because the temperature really went up this week with the and that whole fissure between the mayor's office and the police force, and that's the question of how well is he going to do after that period is over with?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's as honeymoons go. This one was pretty short-lived. I mean, it was maybe a weekend in Branson at best.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so politically, where does this? And by the way, it's worth mentioning the rest of the states watching this, I find, with great interest because of all the obvious dynamics in play here.
Yeah, I think he wants to move on to other issues. Economic development is a real key issue that I think there's going to be a discussion next week on opportunity zones that will and that's to bring some economic development to the stress areas in Little Rock. So I think he wants to move on to some of those type of issues, but it keeps coming back to this issue with the police force, and as long as it stays there, it's going to be a difficult, as we say, a difficult honeymoon.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. Now we've also got a special election coming up just days that was in a way necessitated by the Frank Scott administration. Legislative.
Charles Blake resigned, and now there is the early voting actually began on Tuesday, and the voting on August 6th is when the election is special election called by Governor Asa Hutchinson when Charles Blake, who was the House Minority Leader, resigned to be Mayor Scott's chief of staff. So we got 5 candidates, and all of them will be new. Be the first time they've held elective office.
A safe seat for the Democratic Party. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely. There's not a Republican running. So
Yeah, Wes mentioned the economic development plans of the Scott administration. Rebecca, and the opportunity zone. What else has he got? Not that he doesn't have enough already, but does he got anything else on his agenda that we should look for?
Right. I think that the opportunity zones is really kind of the next leap for Scott. He, in addition to so what the opportunity zones do is they are designed by Hutchinson to provide tax incentives, for investors who then will invest in these opportunity funds.
Right.
And these funds are used to create small businesses in these kind of underserved communities and create jobs. And I think that Scott is really banking on what kind of growth could be created from something like this.
All right, this is in play too in some other Arkansas cities.
yeah, it's 85. Hutchinson selected 85 communities. In Pulaski County, it's 8 communities, and I think the key areas in Little Rock are the Dunbar area going out all the way to the airport area.
Yeah, got to end it there because we're out of time. Thanks for joining us. As always, thanks to you for joining us. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.